to discussion number 9, where we're going to be talking about folk tales around the world and specifically talking about Little Red Riding Hood for today. So a little bit of background for you on Little Red Riding Hood, and you should be taking notes on this because this could be a question or two that appear on the midterm. The European origins of the story can be traced back to the 10th century by several European folktales, including one from Italy called The False Grandmother, or also called The Story of Grandmother. And I have linked a PDF of this version of Red Riding Hood at the bottom of this video in the supplemental material section if you're so interested. It is kind of an interesting interpretation of the story, and it might be interesting to think about when you're thinking about the discussion questions for today as well, but it's not required. So that was an Italian version, and the best known European versions were the ones that we read for today, so the Charles Perrault version as well as the Brothers Grimm version. And then the Chinese tale of Lon Popo, or Granny Wolf, comes from the ancient oral tradition and is thought to be over 1,000 years old, so it's quite old, even though the one that you're reading from today is an adaptation that's more contemporary. So I want to talk to you about two theories surrounding folk tales and basically how fairy tales come about, because as you can see there are many different versions of these fairy tales and they're all around the world. You can also find these definitions on the historical overview of fairy tales and folk tales that you read for the first day of this module, but I want to just highlight these again since we're talking more about the global impact or places where we find fairy tales. So monogenesis is the theory that the tales originated from one single source. So they originated in, Italy, and then they kind of trickled out through other places in the world. And then polygenesis is the theory that tales emerged independently throughout the world. So, they emerged from Italy, from France, from Germany, from China, from India, from Russia, etc. But it wasn't something that had one source. It actually just independently popped up in all these different cultures and became this story that was well known, and then people realized there were these other connections between these other stories that were very similar. So those are the two theories that I want you to keep in mind and make sure that you remember what the differences of those are. So very quickly, I want to talk about some differences between the Perrault and Grimm version. This list was created by some students from a few years back, but there's only really one that I want to point out and talk a little bit about, and that's in the Perrault version that Red Riding Hood and Granny die and the wolf lives, whereas in the Grimm version, Red and Granny live and the wolf dies a very violent death. So I want you to really think about that. Why is there such a harsh ending to the girl in the Perrault version when they basically have disobeyed what they've been told, versus in the Grimm version, why is it that Red and the grandmother live? You might think about that a little bit. We won't explicitly talk about it in the discussion questions for today, but it's definitely something that I want you to consider and think about going back to the author's purposes. Why would they end up doing that? How does that help, speak to their audience in ways that their audience would either learn or connect with the story? So here's a lot of the additions to the Red Riding Hood tradition that Lon Popo adds. One of them being that there's multiple children. Another is that the kids actually stay at home and they trick the wolf and kill it, right? And another thing is that the children are really, really smart and articulate, and they have a really good ideas to kill the wolf. So they kind of have a lot more power over the situation versus the other Little Red Riding Hood traditions. There's some other points on here that you might stop, pause this video, and look over and put down into your own notes. But it's really interesting to see how these stories in some ways are very similar, but also very, very different. So for part one of your discussion number 9, you have 3 of these questions right here that you can choose from. You need to choose only one and make sure that you are following the questions exactly and answering all of them and using textual evidence from each of the stories that you're talking about to answer your questions. If you don't use textual evidence, you won't get a good of a grade on these. And also make sure that you're fully answering the entire question. So the first question of the 3 versions that we read of Little Red Riding Hood for today, which seems to give the child character the most agency? And when I say that, I mean control over their situation, smarts, power to change, the outcome of the story. And when you're thinking about this, I kind of want you to line them up. Which one gives the characters the most agency, which one gives them the least, and which one is in the middle. And then I want you to think about what might be the reasoning behind limiting or expanding a child's agency. Go back and think about an author's purpose, as well as the themes that we talked about, especially with Perrault and with Grimm. What was their purpose for writing? And then also think about the time period that these were written in. The second question is about the gender of the wolf. So I want you to think about, in any of the stories that we read for today, does the author gender the wolf? So does it explicitly tell us the wolf's gender? And if the stories don't give the wolf a gender, do we as the reader have assumptions about what gender the wolf is? Do we automatically assume that it is male or female? And then I want you to think about what are the implications of this. If we do automatically think that the wolf is female or male, what does that mean? What does that bring to the character automatically? So I want you to think about, is the wolf then a deeper metaphor for something else that may harm Little Red? And I want you to consider especially the Perrault and Grimm versions, since we have a lot more historical context for those stories. And then this last question is about gender as well. So I want you to think about the Perrault and Grimm versions of Little Red Riding Hood, but also the stories that we read for last week with Perrault and Grimm. And I want you to think about, what does the message seem to be for boys and for girls? What gender roles do these tales prescribe or tell girls that they must be and boys that they must be? And I want you to think about, because these roles can be viewed as highly limiting to children, should we teach them to children? Should we have them in our syllabus or something that we tell very young children? And then, if so, consider how we can keep the integrity of the original text, so don't change it so much that we don't have the same original story, but also acknowledge that it has some outdated principles.